You're standing in line. Your phone is at 1%. There is nothing to look at, nothing to scroll, nothing to do except exist inside your own head for 90 seconds. It feels unbearable. Your mind starts scratching at the walls of the moment, looking for an exit. But the real answer to why this feels so unbearable is far stranger than you have a short attention span. Boredom is not a flaw in your brain. Boredom is a signal. It is one of the oldest alarm systems your species ever built. Older than language, older than fire, maybe older than the modern human skull itself. And it might be the single reason you are alive to feel bored in the first place. Here is the strange part. In 2014, psychologist Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia ran an experiment that sounds almost like a joke. He put people alone in an empty room for 15 minutes. No phone, no book, just their thoughts. Before the experiment, participants were shown a device that could deliver a mild electric shock, and most of them said they'd pay money never to feel it again. Then Wilson left them alone with nothing but that device and their own minds. 2/3 of the men and 1/4 of the women chose to shock themselves rather than sit quietly and think. One man shocked himself 190 times in 15 minutes. Read that again. People chose pain over stillness. Why would a brain do that? Why would sitting quietly feel worse than an electric shock? The answer starts almost 2 million years ago, on a hot, dry stretch of grassland where a small, slow, physically unimpressive primate was trying not to die. Your ancestors were not the strongest animals on the savannah. They weren't the fastest either. What they had was curiosity, and curiosity is boredom's twin. When food ran low in one place, standing still and waiting was a death sentence. The individuals who felt an itch, an unbearable restlessness that pushed them to wander over the next ridge, to try the unfamiliar route, to follow the unfamiliar river, were the ones who found new water, new prey, new tools. The ones who could sit calmly in a depleted environment, content and unbothered, quietly starved. Boredom, in other words, may be a built-in punishment for staying put. Psychologist John Eastwood at York University spent years studying this feeling and landed on a definition that sounds almost too simple. He describes boredom as the uncomfortable feeling of wanting to be engaged in something and being unable to find it. Not the absence of things to do, the absence of a mental hook to grab onto. Your brain isn't asking for entertainment, it's asking for direction. And when it doesn't get one, it makes you suffer until you find one. That suffering used to point outward, toward the horizon, toward the next valley, toward the unexplored cave. Today, it points toward your phone. There's a reason for that too, and it isn't just weak willpower. Novelty seeking appears to have a genetic fingerprint. Researchers studying a gene called DRD4-7R, sometimes nicknamed the wanderlust gene, found it appears at higher rates in populations with long histories of migration. It's linked to a hunger for new experiences, new stimulation, new information. It doesn't determine behavior on its own, nothing genetic ever does that cleanly, but it hints at something important. The instinct to chase novelty when things feel stale isn't a modern character flaw. It's an inherited compass. So picture your ancestors again. Not comfortable, not safe. Living in small mobile bands where the landscape itself was the entire entertainment system. The pantry, the classroom, and the threat detector all at once. Boredom in that world wasn't a lazy afternoon feeling. It was a klaxon. It meant, this place has taught you everything it can. Move. Learn something new or die slowly not learning it. Contrast that with now. You live in a world engineered to erase every trace of that ancient klaxon. Every app on your phone is a machine built by very smart people to make sure that itch, that restless, I need something new feeling, never has to travel farther than your thumb. The reward used to require crossing a savanna. Now it requires a swipe. Here's the twist most people never think about. That doesn't mean the feeling disappeared. It means the feeling got hijacked. Neuroscientists have shown that novelty itself triggers a release of dopamine, the brain chemical tied to motivation and reward, largely independent of whether the novelty is actually useful to you. Your brain evolved in an environment where new almost always correlated with valuable. a new food source, a new tool, a new ally. It never evolved a filter for a world where new could just as easily mean a stranger's vacation photo or a 15-second video of nothing. The ancient machinery is still running. It just can't tell the difference between a discovery that could save your life and a discovery that wastes your afternoon. This is why boredom on a modern day off can feel almost identical to boredom on the savannah, even though the stakes could not be more different. Your body still floods you with the same restless discomfort. Your brain still says move, still says find something, still says do not sit still in the depleted field. It just doesn't know the field it's picturing is a living room, and the horizon it wants you to chase is a notification. Some researchers argue this mismatch is doing real damage. A team led by psychologist Sandy Mann at the University of Central Lancashire found something almost paradoxical. Boredom, when you actually sit inside it instead of escaping it, can boost creativity. In her studies, people given a deliberately dull task before a creative challenge, like copying numbers out of a phone book, performed better on tests of imaginative thinking afterward than people who skipped the boring task entirely. The dull activity let their minds wander, and mind wandering is where a surprising amount of insight and problem-solving happens. That finding lines up strangely well with the evolutionary story. Boredom wasn't only meant to push you outward toward a new physical location, it was also meant to push you inward toward a new idea. The itch that made a distant ancestor wander past the next ridge is the same itch that, in a mind with nowhere physical left to wander, turns into invention, into art, into problem solving. The tool user who got bored staring at a rock may have been the same one who eventually turned that rock into a blade. So what happens to a species that engineers boredom out of existence? Some of the researchers studying attention and digital behavior worry the answer is, it loses the very discomfort that used to produce its best ideas. If every idle second gets filled before the restlessness has time to build, the mind never gets pushed toward the deeper, associative thinking that produces genuine insight. You get comfortable. You also get, in a strange way, less inventive, because the discomfort that used to demand invention keeps getting soothed before it can finish its job. Think about the last time you had a genuinely good idea. Not a scheduled brainstorm. Not a meeting where you were told to be creative on command. A real idea. The kind that arrives uninvited. Where were you? Chances are it wasn't while you were scrolling. It was in the shower, on a walk with no destination, lying in bed in that stretch of time before sleep when there's nothing left to check and nowhere left to look. Those are the last unfilled pockets of modern life, and it may be no accident that they're also where your best thinking happens. Your mind, finally left alone, does what it was built to do in every empty moment for 2 million years. It wanders looking for a problem to solve. There's a name for this in cognitive science: the default mode network. It's a set of brain regions that switches on precisely when you are not focused on a task, when your attention is unfocused and drifting. For a long time, researchers assumed this network was doing nothing, a kind of idle hum. Studies using brain imaging have since shown the opposite. This resting network is remarkably active, stitching together memories, emotions, and ideas that your focused, task-driven brain never has time to connect. Boredom is, in a very real sense, the feeling of that network being switched on. The itch you're trying to escape is your own mind quietly doing its most important work. Watch a child who has just been told, "Go play, there's nothing to do," and you can see this ancient machinery in its rawest form. Within minutes, a bored child invents a game out of a cardboard box, a rule out of nothing, a whole imaginary world out of an empty afternoon. Developmental psychologists have long noted that unstructured, unscheduled time, the kind adults often rush to eliminate, is where children build imagination, self-direction, and problem-solving skills that structured activities rarely teach as well. A child who is never allowed to be bored is a child who never has to invent anything because something has always already been provided. The invention muscle only grows in the gap first and lose it fastest. Every commute, every waiting room, every quiet dinner is now, by default, filled, which means the mental muscle that used to build ideas out of empty time is, for most adults, quietly atrophying. Not because people got lazier or less intelligent, because the environment stopped asking that muscle to do any work at all. There's something almost humbling in that. The feeling you spend so much energy trying to escape. The itchy, restless, slightly miserable sensation of having nothing to do might be one of the most important tools your species ever had. It sent your ancestors across continents. It's part of why humans are the only primate found on every landmass on Earth, from the Arctic to the equator to islands separated from any other land by thousands of miles of open ocean. Boredom didn't stop them. Boredom moved them. And it's not just about migration. Every technology you've ever used exists because someone at some point could not stand the feeling of things staying the same. Fire, agriculture, the wheel, the printing press, the smartphone in your hand right now. They're all downstream of a species that could not sit still with an unsolved problem or an empty afternoon. Which brings the question back to you, standing in that line, phone at 1%, 90 unbearable seconds stretching out in front of you like a desert. That feeling clawing at the inside of your skull isn't a malfunction. It's the same ancient signal that once sent a small band of primates across an entire planet. It's not telling you that you're broken. It's telling you that you're exactly the kind of animal that never learned how to stay still, because the ones who did didn't leave any descendants. So the next time your mind starts scratching at the walls of a quiet moment, maybe don't reach for the phone quite so fast. That discomfort has a 2-million-year-old resume. It has crossed oceans. It has invented tools out of rocks and stories out of silence. Maybe it isn't asking you to be entertained. Maybe it's asking you to become someone new.